beautiful movie, and we had a great discussion afterward. He's been very generous with his time and went to Mark's Hebrew class and Israeli literature class, and participated in a conversation here at the RCH this afternoon with faculty and community members, and that was wonderful. He's very accomplished. He teaches Hebrew and Israeli literature and Israeli culture at Queens College. He's not only written, as many of us academics, his academic kind of works and articles and prose, but has written a novel and 4 books of poetry. One that he's brought called Jews, which has been translated into English. One that looks at Ashdod and Ashdodian language. In addition to that, if that's not humbling enough, he's directed and is a screenwriter for 3 documentaries. One that was shown yesterday, which looks at an accomplished Moroccan Israeli poet, Ezra Miton, and the challenges of Mizrahim in Israel over time, which is also a subject of much of his poetry and writing. Sami came to Israel at age 4 from Morocco. His parents came speaking Arabic and French, and also biblical Hebrew that they had learned in the Hebrew school. But now he writes all of his poetry in Hebrew, and was telling us in the afternoon that even though he's lived in New York 8 years now, he's still only written kind of about the Moroccan, largely is not written about what takes place in his life in New York, but still harkening back to Morocco and to Israel and so forth. So really interesting poetry that also deals with some of the political and societal tensions and frictions in Israel as well. So we're so thrilled to have you. His other 2 documentary films, the previous one to this was focused on the experiences of his mother and her girlfriends in Israel, who are in their 70s now, but look back at their early years in Morocco, and also all the years in Israel and different experiences and challenges that they had. And the first documentary was on Black Panthers, which is the Israeli Black Panther movement and power movement for Mizrahi Israelis, which are Israelis who came from Spain, North Africa, and a lot of the countries in the Middle East. After the establishment of Israel, many, up to 1 million, were expelled from countries like Egypt and Libya and other countries around the world. In Morocco, they were not expelled and came for a variety of multiple reasons, and he'll engage some of the ambivalences and harkening back to the life in Morocco in his poetry. So thank you so much, and Nita Skeen is going to give the poetry in English after Sami gives it in Hebrew. He says that because the translations feel unfamiliar to him, that it's almost strange. It almost doesn't feel like his poetry when he's saying it in English, so that's why I'd like to have someone else do it. But we really look forward to hearing the poetry, and hopefully you can stick around and we can have some discussion, perhaps, and questions about it when we're done. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sami.
Good evening. Thank you again. Yael, Mar, Jewish Studies, Israeli Studies, whatever else is involved, Hebrew Studies. Thank you, Anita, for doing this. It's exciting. Thank you for coming. You hear me well? Okay. So, I will read a selection of my poems that I've chosen. Could be any other selection of poems. So I don't know, it's interesting to me also to choose a dozen of poems, and sometimes I don't know if I choose these poems because these are the ones that represents my poetry or represents me, or I'm used to people actually liking these poems. So I don't know, it could be all together. And but out of 5 books of poems, many poems, I had to choose some. But we have, I have with me a collection of my poems. It's not a translation of a specific book. it's a collection of poetry in English translation. Just came out a few months ago. From all of my poetry books for the last 30 years. I'm that old. Publishing. And so I'll read some and then tell a story here and there. And then, of course, you'll hear the English from Mita. And although I can read English, very strange to me to read my poems in English. I tried once or twice and then I gave up on that. Because I don't read it passionately. I read it like I read something in class with someone else. Okay. So this is the first group of poems, which is interesting because the last group of poems will be somehow a change of perspective on the way I looked at my Moroccan identity, memory, history. And so these poems were written, I think, around the late 80s, most of them. And where Morocco was, for me, really somewhere behind the, as we said, the dark mountains. And somewhere probably I won't visit again. And so it was all memories and feelings through my memory of my grandfather, of my family members, of the stories. The last group is actually after I went to Morocco, and it was a change of perspective looking from there, which is interesting. So we'll see how it works. Okay, first one, in Hebrew, Saba Yahya, Grandpa Yahya, about my grandfather. סבא שלי, יחיאל, קראו אותו יחיה. מרחק בינינו כך וכך שנות לימוד בארץ ישראל. כך וכך שנות אבק על סידור התפילה. כמה וכמה פיוטים, כך וכך זמירות נשכחות. דדה שלי, יחיה, חי ומת בארץ המגרב. כך וכך שעות טיסה מארץ ישראל. פעמים אפגוש בו בירושלים. ג'לבה לבנה, ברי שחור, ידיו שלובות לאחור, חולף אותי, בתום לב, אינו מכיר בי דמותו. עוד בילדותי, בליל ההגדה, כשהייתה אמי קמה לפתוח דלתה לכבוד אליהו שיבוא, הייתי אני מייחל לו וסבא שלי יחיה.
I want to say at the outset, I'm very honored to be reading with Sami tonight. And I also want to say that you're listening to a female Appalachian Christian reading these poems. So if I pause to try to get some words right, there's French and there's Hebrew and there's Arabic. And Spanish is the other language I learned. So I will do my best, but please bear with me if I'm stuck. Grandpa Yahya. My grandpa Yehiel, they called him Yahya. The distance between us is so school years in the land of Israel, so dust years on the prayer book, so psalms, so forgotten hymns. My dada Yahya lived and died in Maghreb, so hours of flight from the land of Israel. At times I run into him in Jerusalem, white jalaba, black beret, hands crossed behind his back, passing me by, innocently not recognizing his image in me. Even as a child, on the night of the Seder, when my mother would rise to open her door in honor of Elijah that he may come, I would wish for him, for my grandpa Yahya.
Thank you. Very good. Thanks a lot. Okay. Another poem. Well, that was a grandfather which after we came to Israel, it was already after he died. And always for me was, he belonged to the old world, you know. We came relatively late to Israel in the beginning of the 60s, 1963, and we lived in working class or unemployed class, as you call it. They call it working class, most people didn't know. But working class, really, a neighborhood of immigrants, mostly from North Africa. And when I have memories, it's not only visual, it's sounds and different rings. And this one is about names, our names, in that position. אלה שמות, והיו לנו שמות עם ריח חוס לארץ. עלה ויה למזור, ויט, ז'קי, תלעתה, גריה. והיה בבר עם גופה משולשת, פטריק וז'וז'ו ודדה. לבנות היו שמות פעמונים, בריז'יט, אליס, מישל, ז'ורג'ט ואנט. והמורה רשמה לנו ביומן שמותינו עבריים, אילן, יעקב, אברהם, דוד ועליזה, זהבה וחנה. יעני בא להגיד לנו, ידענו, אבל התעקשנו עוד קצת ניחוח חוץ לארץ, לפני שידום צלצול הפעמונים, סמי, ממי, מימי, בשל, מרדושי.
These are the names. And we had names with an overseas scent. Alen, Bine a la Maison, Vit, Jackie, Tel al-Aladar, Diha. And there was Beber with the triangle bod, and Patrick, and Jojo, and Dede. The girls had names like Bells, Brigitte, Alice, Michelle, Georgette, and Annette. And the teacher wrote for us in her roster our names in Hebrew. Elan, Yaakov, Abraham, David, Alisa, Zehava, and Hannah. Whatever, she thought she was going to tell us, we knew. But we insisted on a bit more of an overseas scent with the ringing of the bell, before the ringing of the bells is silenced. Sami, Mimi, Rachel, Mardosha.
Thank you. Well, there's actually real stories about this. I'm sure everyone who grew up in that era and came to Israel with the foreign name went through this, changing names. Someone today doing a paper on changing names, right? Yeah. So I was thinking about that. Yeah, she said she couldn't do it today. So I remember my case. Well, I remember it was very simple. First grade in Israel, but there was beginning for me, well, kindergarten and school, that it's up there.
It's a dining hall upstairs.
Oh,
Okay.
architect wasn't so successful on that. Okay. Well, so I remember very clearly. I remember that memory that the teacher really reads our name. Well, she has the foreign names, okay, on this Moroccan French names, and she reads, and as she goes, she of course changes the name, just like that, into Hebrew. Of course, no one would dare to protest or anything, me included. So she will read, I don't know, like the names we read here, Jackie, there was Yaakov, and then Beber, there was Abraham, and sometimes she just made up names like Patrick. How do you? So she said Pinchas. I remember Patrick and David, a friend of mine. She took the P and the P, and then she came to my name. It was always last because it's Shin, the alphabet. And she says, "Oh, Sami, that's easy. Shmuel." And I just remember bursting crying. I couldn't protest, I just cried and cried. He tried to calm me down, and then I went to my father, and I told him the story, and I was crying. And of course, he protested more than me. Back to school. His Hebrew wasn't so great. We were just 2 years in the land. And then, so he gave her a little lecture about my name. He said, never change the names of my kids. He was very angry. He said, this is his name, it's not Shmuel, it's Sami, and give her a little lecture about how it's Arabic. It's an Arab name, really, and about the root of Sana, and what does it mean, Sami, Samia, for a girl. And of course, that was the teacher of first and second grade. Then came the teacher of third grade. And then the story repeats until I learned to give that lecture and to protect my name. But I think it was an instinct for me to, and I had a Hebrew name always. It was named after my grandfather, Shalom, the middle name. So, but that's when it was funny. It's hard to go back to the mind of a 6-year-old. I have no idea where things came from, but it was like, almost like stealing my very self away from me. So that's the way. And then we had just an anecdote. There's a word here. So the translator, how do you do this? So I don't know. So, whatever. I said, okay. But there is, in our language, there's a lot of. Okay, so here we are in that neighborhood in Ashdod. It's a new town established in 1956 by the Mediterranean coast, beautiful, like 20 miles from Tel Aviv, south of Tel Aviv. In the seaport, and it was all about, it was mostly new immigrants from North Africa. Later on came the immigrants, or Olim, as we call them, from Russia. It's a little different today than my town. This one is called Yoter Mikolam. And again, it's about the change, transition, change, sometimes forced change, cultural one. יותר מכולם. יותר מכולם, more than voices, which is not a great translation, but it's okay. בילדותי ניגנו רבים. צלילי מערב ובשירת ערב, אך יותר מכולם, יותר מכולם, עולה בנגינת קולו, חודרת עצמות של הדוד בנימין. שם בסעודות המפוארות שנדר דודי לשנים, לזכר הצדיק רבי דוד בן ברוך, בסלון הקטן הדחוס ברווחה, שירה ופית וריחות הערק, מצחוקי בדיחות עולים חדשים. דור המדבר. הלכו קולות ילדותי, הלך גם הדוד בנימין. על תקנית חורק אנריקו מסיאס עודנו שר, עזבתי את מולדתי, עזבתי את ביתי.
More than voices. In my childhood, many played sounds of the West and songs from Arabia. But more than all, more than their voices, rises in me the bone-piercing melody of the voice of Uncle Benjamin. There in the magnificent feasts that my uncle vowed for years in memory of the righteous Rabbi David ben Baruch, in the small living room comfortably crowded, song and psaltery and scents of Iraq, and the laughter of new immigrant jokes, the desert generation. Gone are the sounds of my childhood. Gone too is Uncle Benjamin. On a screechy old record, Enrico Macias,
Still sings.
Here comes my French. J'ai quitté mon pays Je quitte my song, I left my country, I left my home.
Thank you. J'ai quitté mon pays, j'ai quitté ma maison. It's the famous song by Rico Macias, who's an Algerian Jew, musician, loved by all North African Jews and many others in France and Europe, who immigrated to, I mean, like many Algerian Jews after the independence, when the French left, so he wrote his first most beautiful poems about his longing to his homeland, but he was talking about Algeria. So, yeah, those voices. If you want to say something in the middle, we can really, or play some instrument. Usually I do it. I never dare to do this without a musician. I didn't tell you that, huh? Someone says plays the viola. Oh, you have your viola?
I didn't bring it with me.
Ah. My son plays the viola. Well, he did at least. So, really, there were some characters in my family that, as a child, not only in imagination, but it is mostly imagination, because I heard all the stories. I don't remember anything from Morocco. What do you remember from that age, 4 years old? But all the stories have been told about my grandfather and my uncles and my grandmother, and so I like to play with words before I even written a word. Letters became my toys. But in my mind, I was always building those big legends and fairy tales about those characters and imagining them, those scenes that my father used to tell us and my mother. And, but in reality, in Israel, they didn't look so magnificent or glorious. They were just trying to survive, he was trying to survive. And my uncle Shimon, he really represented the glory of our family in Morocco. It's a big tribe in the southeast part of Morocco, called the Tafilal, living in some villages, and he was the sheikh, he was the sheikh, the leader of the Jews in that region. He was very well respected, because I hear the stories from my father. When he walks down the streets, people come to him and bow and kiss his hand. But then again, I see him sitting in the corner of the market and selling nana, sitting on a little stool. And he was, so those contradictions, always provoked my thinking from early on. I remember going with my father, I was very young, to the market place in Ashdod, and then he would say, oh, let's go around, because he sees his brother from far away. And I said, well, let's say hello to him. No. I don't want him to see us seeing him, because he'll be so embarrassed that we saw him sitting there on the ground and selling, couldn't get that as a young kid, because he was my great uncle. I don't remember my grandfather. And from him, I learned so much Moroccan Arabic, because he spoke to me only till his last day. It was very quiet, just really receding from life, not much function in community really, and slowly until he passed away. So this is something I wrote for him. דוד שמעון מת. דוד שמעון מת, דוד שמעון מת ומתה עמו עיסה גדולה של נשמתנו. דוד שמעון מת, קברנו אותו במוצאי שבת בין קודש לחול, כפי שקוברים צדיקים, והירח זרח כמעט במילואו, מגלה את פניהן הנפולות של נשותינו היפות. דוד שמעון מת, והגברים כאשר חשו איך ברוחם יורדים גם הם מדרגה נוספת אל הבור. דוד שמעון מת ואני פשוט בכיתי. ורק אחר כך נבהלתי מאוד איך אנחנו הולכים ומתייתמים. עכשיו כשקוראים קדיש על קברו, נזכרתי אני בתמונה אחת של ינקותי בנווה מדבר הסהרה. דודי צולה בשר על גחלים, ואני קורע על ידו כדרך החתולים לקבל פיסה קטנה ורכה לעיסה. תמונה אחת רחוקה עכשיו כרחוק המגרב מהמשרק, כרחוק הדוד שמעון מקברו המתמלא עפר ללא שוב.
Uncle Shimon is dead. Uncle Shimon is dead. Uncle Shimon is dead, and with him died a great piece of our soul. Uncle Shimon is dead. We buried him at night after Shabbat between Kodesh Lahol, as you bury the righteous, and the moon shone almost full, revealing the fallen faces of our beautiful women. Uncle Shimon is dead, and the men, as they carried him, felt how in spirit they too descend another step into the hollow. Uncle Shimon is dead, and I just cried. Only later I got very frightened, how we are slowly orphaning. Now, as they read Kaddish over his grave, I recall an image from my infancy in the Saharan oasis. My uncle grilling meat over coals, and I kneel before him as cats do, to receive a tender little piece to chew. One distant image, distant now, like the distance of the Maghreb from the Mashrek, like the distance of Uncle Shimon, growing full, dust to no return.
Thank you. Actually, this is not really my memory. He told me that story.
I was going to ask if you actually remembered it.
No, but in my mind, because he told me that very early, it became a memory. It has visual and has sounds to it, and I can see the cat sitting there chewing next to me. But he told me that story, not only me, he said you and his daughter, Lisa, and others, whenever he was barbecuing some lamb stuff, and we would just sit there and wait, cut it in pieces. There was no chewing gum, there was actually.
So he told you that story
Yeah.
in Iraq and Arabic, and you wrote about it in your poem in Hebrew.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. You know, I was when I first went to Morocco, I was afraid to open my mouth. I understand everything. People can talk next to me as much as they want. But I was so afraid because I didn't speak to him. I spoke only to my grandmother. And she died a long time ago. And I was so scared to open my mouth and say something. I can say, I could then say like expression. I was sure about to say how are you and this and that. But really to have a conversation, I was really frightened. And then so I said, well, I'll try the market. I just went into the market and I started. Of course, this laughing at me a little bit, but they encouraged me also. They said, good, continue. You know, even you can speak up. It's okay. And then after a day, then after 2 days, after 3 days, I was like growing, and I was surprised. And I called my father from Morocco. She was amazed because I was in his village Skyping. And he said, where are you? I said, no village, Skyping you from, there's a cafe in the net. He said, not in my village. There was barely a phone when we left. It was very funny. So we talked, and I said to him, you know, I don't know where all this army came from, because they stopped talking to us at home, just my mother a little bit. And I forgot all about my Uncle Shimon. And he reminded me, because my father, for him, was like a second father. she was much older than my father, like 15 years between them, 13 siblings. And so he respected him and his advice, and he would go to his home every Friday, not the evening, celebrate at home, but like early afternoon, so 1 o'clock, to have tea, meet with Nana, and talk. And he would consult with him, and he would drag me there, and I hated that. I said, no, come to me, Shimon, and sit right here. And I would just sit and listen to this, this old people talking about business, about politics, about money, about loan, about anything, and only in Arabic. One Hebrew word in the early days. And then years went by, and I was already in the army. I was coming for vacations, or I went to college and was coming to visit, and I would always find a little message from, my mother would have a message for me. You should go to Shimon, he wants to have a cup of tea with you. The minute you come, please go see him. And he kept talking to me, just in Arabic. I would answer in Hebrew. I think all that Arabic just was waiting there. There is no other solution, because with my grandmother, just chit-chat, like, what do you feel, stuff like that. But I didn't hear that much Arabic. It's impossible. It was him. Just yeah.
Sami, were there any photos from that time?
Yeah. Should have screened some photos.
No,
Yeah.
of your family.
Oh yeah, yeah. We were fortunate because my father always carried the camera with him. So he came from Casablanca to study. In fact, to his home village, and then we got married. He moved to a bigger town, Rashidia, that is it's a regional city that gives services to all the area, the villages. And so he always carried the camera. We even had 8mm footage that he took with his parents and others. And for some of my cousins, it will be the only pictures they could see of their parents. And yeah, so we have, quite a few of the family of my grandparents, so Uncle Shimon also as well. So, and of my parents, their engagement, okay. This is like the story of my life. Okay, I'm going to years go by, and I was a very patriotic Zionist as when I was young, and I joined the Nachman, if you're familiar with this.